Hey guys, so today I thought I'd go over some little tips for the Cyber Dragon cards and other staples that are played in Cyber Dragons, so that for those of you playing the deck, especially the newer players, will know the in and outs. Now at times there will be some small overlap with the Cyber Dragon ruling videos that I just covered for the sake of completeness, but I will link those videos in the description below, and I highly recommend viewing them if you haven't to really understand this deck better. Anyways guys, if you want more Cyber Dragon content, consider liking the video and subscribing to make my day. Alright, so let's just get started with our main guy, Core. So in terms of what I search for Core, obviously, if you only have one piece of the puzzle, for example, you have Galaxy Soldier, then you'd search for like the emergency to get your Hertz, or if you have something like Hertz, then you'd search the repair plan to get your Soldier. But in instances where you already have access to your Nova Infinity play without having to rely on Core, in that instance then I like to search for Overflow if I don't feel confident that I'm able to kill them that turn. Let's say they have multiple back row cards, so it's kind of unrealistic that you kind of play through all of it, and in this case it kind of gives you that follow-up play to kind of pop some spell traps on your opponent's turn or in your next turn, for example. But in other instances, let's say where your opponent doesn't have back row cards but does have multiple cards in their hand, so you are worried about Nibiru, I do like to search for the ref system so that I can kind of extend further if I get Nibiru'd and kind of still OTK them. So for example, the most common time where we get Nibiru'd is, when we are kind of in this situation, because like for example Nova was our 5th summon, and then we get Nibiru'd here, and then in that instance, Nova's effect would trigger and we bring out Chimeratech Rampage. And if you search that ref system, you can send something like Naxxur and Cyber Dragon with Rampage, and then you can use that ref system you searched earlier to bring back the Naxxur, and then Naxxur brings back the Cyber Dragon, and then you can just link into that Seeger to go for the OTK, assuming that your opponent just still has just that Nibiru on their field, and you can go for game this way. Now, as most of you will know, Core's effect to search on summon is mandatory, which can be troublesome at times, because let's say if your opponent has a monster that can negate monster effects and destroy them, and all you wanted to do was contact fuse away a monster in their extra monster zone, then instead of summoning it and triggering its mandatory effect, you could always set the Core, ask your opponent if they have a response on the set, and if they say no, then you could just contact fuse away your opponent's monster in the extra monster zone for that mega fleet. Now in terms of Core's graveyard effect, now obviously most of the time in the mid to late game scenario you're banishing it so that you can special summon the Naxxur from deck, so you can bring back the Nova, the Infinity, or the Rampage in your graveyard. But in instances where you don't have a good target like that, and let's say you had another baby Cyber Dragon in grave, let's just say in this example you just had another Core, you could bring out the Hertz, you could for example contact fuse if they have a monster in the extra monster zone, or let's say relinquished anima. But in this instance, let's say you go into that mega fleet, you can use Hertz effect to add back that baby Cyber Dragon to your hand, and you can summon it. Now of course in this instance you can't use Core's effect because you already used the other graveyard effect this turn, but at least now it gives you those two bodies to go into Anaconda and use its effects and Red Eyes Fusion, whole Dragoon package to bring out Dragoon. So Core's effect just becomes even more useful now, even when you don't have a good target with Naxxur, because at least it just gives you that extra special summon body onto the field. So you just need to summon one more monster out and go into Anaconda to bring out Dragoon. Next, let's just quickly go over Repair Plan. So most of the time, we're just using its first effect to add that generally Galaxy Soldier, sometimes Jizukuru with Repair Plant, but always be aware of your graveyard. If you have at least 3 Cyber Dragons in your graveyard, which includes your baby Cyber Dragons because they're Cyber Dragon in grave, then you can use both effects sequentially and you can return that one light machine monster back to deck. So that means you can either, let's say return one OG Cyber Dragon to make your machine dupe live again. If you play 3 Galaxy Soldiers and let's say you had already used 2 of them earlier in your turn, you can bring back one back to your deck. That means you have 2 left in your deck again and it becomes live. Or another example would be to actually return back Seeger back into the extra deck in case it was destroyed earlier in the duel, and that way you kind of have a way to go into it again and OTK with Rampage. Okay, now let's move on to machine duplication. So let's just start with kind of like the basics and obvious things. One, of course, your targeted baby Cyber Dragon monster does have to be face up on resolution for this to summon out the 2 Cyber Dragons. And 2, if you ever summon out your baby Cyber Dragon, obviously don't special summon out the Veer if you were planning on using machine dupe, because Veer is going to increase their attack by 500. So now they're too large to be able to be paired with machine dupe and summon out the 2 Cyber Dragons. Now let's say you use core and you get hit by something like impermanence or effect failure. In that instance, and you have machine dupe, a lot of times it may still just be worth using it. I mean, for one, you can always now turbo out into Anaconda to go into, you know, Dragoon anyways. But let's say you were trying to go into Rampage instead, and in that instance, you know, I still would just summon out 1 core and not both, because this way, you know, you just summon out the 2, so you have just enough to go into Anaconda. You would send the Overload Fusion and you bring out the Rampage Dragon, and then this way you can now send Hertz and that 3rd core in deck to grave, and then Hertz will add that core back to hand because your other 2 cores would have been banished off of Overload Fusion. So that way you can summon out Rampage, and this is 4 summons at this point, and you can get that 3rd core back to hand if you get hit by effect negation on your baby Cyber Dragon while you're machine duping. Now, one thing to note is that if you already have, let's say, like 1 original Cyber Dragon in hand, and assuming you're going second right now, and you have the machine dupe, don't feel like you always have to kind of special summon that Cyber Dragon because it's a free body, because to kind of play around Nibiru, because it's pretty easy to OTK your opponent depending on what they have on the field. So if you have enough to game your opponent with just these 2 cards, instead you should save that monster in your hand, because for example, let's say you summon the core and let's say it gets ashed, and then you can use machine dupe and you summon the 2 Cyber Dragons, right? So you do your typical Nova play, and in this instance you would go into Almiraj so that you have that Cyber Dragon monster engraved, so that you can use Nova's effect, and then you would use that effect to detach and summon. And at this point you have 5 summons, right? And we do this because we were trying to go into Anaconda and have enough bodies. So now if we were to get Nibiru here, you can summon out the Rampage using Nova's effect, and then using Rampage's effect you can send the Hertz and Naxxur, and then the Hertz would add back to Naxxur, and because you saved that 1 Cyber Dragon monster in hand, you can now pitch with the Naxxur, and then Naxxur bring back Cyber Dragon, and then we go into our Seeger. So depending on the situation, you know, there's no reason to overextend. You can always keep that extra monster in your hand like that Cyber Dragon, so that in case you get Nibiru, you can kind of have a follow-up play with the Naxxur. Some other little tidbits: if you're someone like me who plays summon limit in their side, when you machine dupe, they do both come out at the same time, so it's still considered as 1 summon even if you are summoning out 2 Cyber Dragons from deck. And lastly, one thing when you're going up against dinos is that if they have Lost World up and you have a Lost World token, you can't use machine dupe because you can only target token monsters because of Lost World. So that's why Lost World is a pretty difficult card for our deck, or at least can be. Okay, now let's move on to Foolish Burial, which of course is not a Cyber Dragon specific card, but we do all run it. And unlike other decks, it's not something where we always start off our play with. It's actually something that comes very useful later in the duel, because for example, you can use Foolish to send that Hertz, so you can add something like Core or Naxxur from your grave, or return your Seeger back into the extra deck. It also helps keep your Cyber Repair Plant live, right? So for example, if you have some kind of weird hand like this, then you could use the Foolish, and let's say you send that Core to grave. You could use the Repair Plant to search the Galaxy Soldier, and then use Soldier, Chainlink 1, Chainlink 2, and now you can add that Core back into back to your hand, and then add the second Soldier from your deck. And then here you can do your Nova Infinity play with your Soldier, and you now have that Core back in your hand, and you can summon it for like another search. Lastly, another way Foolish becomes useful is when you have machine dupe but no other targets in your hand, and assuming that your opponent has monsters and you don't, you can send the Core from your deck and then banish the Core, special summon, you know, a baby Cyber Dragon, and then you can use Machine Dupe, and now you have a target. Next, with Cybernetic Overflow, we did cover this in the ruling video, but for example, if you were to search core and they try to use something like Imparm or Veiler that targets, then you can flip Overflow to banish it and then pop your opponent's card. That way core's effect will still resolve because their Imperm or Effect Veiler missed target. Of course, the common interaction with Cybernetic Overflow is with Cyber Load Fusion, because let's say on your opponent's end phase, you could flip Cybernetic Overflow, banish Cyber Dragon monsters to pop a couple cards, and then on resolution, you would now then Cyber Load Fusion to return those monsters, Cyber Dragon monsters that you just banished back into the deck, and then summon out the Chimeratech Rampage and pop spell and traps on their end phase. One last thing to note, if you're someone that sides Artifact Lancia, then you kind of have to be careful if you're gonna shotgun the Lancia in your standby phase, because then you can't banish, which means your overflow is now turned off. So make sure to know whether you want to wait until they set or summon something and pop and then use the Lancia, or whether you are fine with just this card being dead and prioritizing Lancia. Next, let's quickly cover Nova. Now, for the most part, we really only just use Nova just to go into Infinity, but there are rare instances where Nova's effect still comes very, very useful to pump itself, because it can pump itself to 42 by banishing a Cyber Dragon on the field, or also in hand, although if it's from hand, it has to be the original Cyber Dragon, and that can really catch your opponents off guard and could potentially be game. So just make sure to kind of do the math. Let's say when you're bringing back, with Naxxter, if you're trying to decide between bringing back Nova or Infinity, sometimes it might make sense to bring back the Nova, because now you can banish it to pump itself to 42, and that could be the game ender. Also, make sure to use Nova's effect during damage step, just so that it doesn't get hit by something like Ogre, unless you want it to get hit by Ogre, so you can bring out Rampage. Now, to move on to Infinity, in terms of which monster I detach first when I try to use Infinity's effect to negate and destroy, sometimes it may not matter, because if you already have a Cyber Dragon engraved, then you already have your material to use for Cybernetic Overflow, and you have your Cyber Repair Plant live. So in some situations, it may not matter what you detach. But let's say if you have an access to Naxxter, whether it's in your hand, or let's say Naxxter's in your grave and you have Cyber Ref System in your hand, then it would be worthwhile to detach the Nova first when you use Infinity's effect. That way, if Infinity does survive your opponent's turn and then it's your next turn, then you can summon out that Naxxter to bring back that Nova. And then if you're like me, who plays a second Infinity, then you can pop that one right there, and now you have two Infinities on board. Another thing about Infinity is that, when you're using its effect to negate during the battle phase, just be kind of careful about that it's going to lose that 200 attack, and sometimes it might make the difference, because let's say you now, after using its effect, Infinity is not strong enough to go over your opponent's monster, for example. So be careful when you're using its effect during battle phase if that 200 attack boost is going to make a difference. And then lastly, let's say you're in the situation where your opponent has a Crusadia Avermax in the extra monster zone, and because you can't target it, remember that you even with Nova or Infinity, you can still go into Mega Fleet, and you could kind of contact fuse away their Avermax to go into Mega Fleet. Like, that option is always there, so be aware of that. Next, let's cover Cyber Dragon Seeger. I did mention this in the ruling video, but remember that if you are going to pump itself up, then you do have to use it before Seeger declares an attack. Also, remember to, if you're pumping a different monster, let's say something like Rampage, remember to use that effect during the damage step, just because it is safer. That way you don't get hit by Ghost Ogre when you use Seeger's effect. And even when you attack directly, there is still a damage step, so you can still use Seeger's effect then. Also, if you were to bring back Seeger with Cyber Ref System, then you have this monster that can pump itself to 4200 attack, and it also can't be destroyed by card effects, so that can be pretty useful as well. Lastly, Seeger is a Cyber Dragon on the field. So for example, if you were in a situation where you use, you're attacking with Nova, and then in the damage step, you could chain Seeger's effect to pump itself to, or pump Nova rather, to 42, and then chain Nova's effect to banish Seeger, because it's a Cyber Dragon on the field, and then it would now become 6300 attack, and who knows, sometimes that could be game. So that's an interaction there. Next, to cover Chimeratech Rampage, let's just say that you knew that you can go into Nova using Rampage, and assuming that this was properly fusion summoned this turn, which is relevant for this example. So in that case, you can consider sending Naxter with Rampage on the first send, and let's just send a core as well. That way, if you go into Nova, you can use Nova's effect to detach the Rampage, and then special summon that Naxter that you sent, and then Naxter can bring back the Rampage because it was properly fusion summoned this turn. And then you can first go into Infinity, and then now you can use Rampage effect again because it is a soft once per turn. And in this instance, you can send like the Hertz and let's just say the Veer, so that you can add back the core back to hand, so that this way you are able to get both the Infinity and the Rampage out. Although of course this path is a bit more susceptible to Nibiru at around this point before you can go into your Infinity, but that's just an option to consider. Okay, so next let's cover Almiraj. So remember that you can use its effect to tribute itself off to protect a monster that you control from destruction by card effects. But let's say your opponent is attacking your Infinity and that's going to be the only attack for the turn. It may still be worthwhile to just tribute off the Almiraj if you have that core engrave. That way you kind of clear, and let's say this gets destroyed by battle, and that way you kind of clear your own field, and next turn you can use the core engrave and banish it to special summon that Naxter, and then Naxter you can bring back the the Nova or the Infinity, so that's something to consider. Also, if a normal summon monster that you control is destroyed by battle, then you can actually special summon Almiraj from the grave, and if that was your opponent's last attack, for example, then that gives you that little extra monster as you start your turn. And if you have another monster that you can normal summon, then now you have two bodies to go into Anaconda and bring out Dragoon. Now of course, if you do special summon the Almiraj out, then it can conflict if you were to have core engrave, for example, because you'd rather have no monsters, so you can banish it from grave to special the Naxter and bring back Nova Infinity. So kind of depends on the situation. Now let's cover Predaplant, Verte, Anaconda. So now one thing you should always make a habit of when playing this game is that you should always be aware of your life points and your opponent's life points. And I know that sounds really obvious, but in kind of like this grind game and you're super into this game, you can get carried away and realize that you may go into Anaconda and realize that you don't actually have enough life points to activate its effect, and now you're kind of dead in the water. And this especially comes up when you red reboot your opponent, because if you use it while you have 4,000 or below life points, you won't be able to use Anaconda's effect. So just be careful of going into it in those situations, because you're not going to be able to resolve it. Also, because if you use Anaconda's effect, you can't special summon monsters. Make sure to bring out the Seeger if you're going that route, for example, before you use its effect. And also, you have to be careful when you use Naxter's effect to bring back a machine monster with 2100 attack or defense, because then you get locked into machines and you can't go into Anaconda. So just if you're going that route, for example, summon out the Anaconda first, then use Naxter's effect and bring it back, and then go into the Seeger and then use its effect and send the Overload Fusion. And lastly, one more random example is if you're using Kaiju or Nibiru, make the habit of putting that Nibiru token or the Kaiju under the empty extra monster zones, because if you play Relinquished Animal, which you probably should, then that way you can suck up either the Kaiju or the Nibiru token, and with the token example, its attack would just be 0. So make the habit of always just putting it under the empty extra monster zone. And as an aside, Relinquished Anima has another use because it is a spellcaster, so it can help you play under a Secret Village, so that can come up sometimes. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. Hope you guys learned at least one new tip playing this Cyber Dragon deck. Again, if you enjoy playing Cyber Dragons and you enjoy Cyber Dragon content, then consider subscribing to see more videos like this. That's it for me guys, take care.